EA Sports. It's in the game. All right, let's go ahead and get to it. From the EPR Creations studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you the Unconquered podcast, or Unconquered with Doc Staples if you prefer that name. So, as always, this podcast brought to you by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. And Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Starting to be a pretty good time to buy. And if you are in one of those states, give Justin Galloway a call, and he will make sure that you get the absolute best in service. He'll hook you up, y'all. Give him a holler. Let him know you heard about him from Unconquered. After all the waiting, after all the slow months of summer, after a leave of absence for me for a little bit to try to get other things in line, it's here, guys. College football season is here. This is the first preview of the season, previewing the Georgia Tech opener. Florida State, Georgia Tech playing in Ireland in the Aer Lingus College Football Classic. Of course, college game day is going to be on hand. Wouldn't want things to get out of hand with that, or FSU fans shouting things from, say, Ted Lasso fans and all of that. Wouldn't want that kind of example. Be classy, folks. Of course, we wouldn't want anything like that to happen at all. But it's an absolute opportunity. It's an absolute showcase game for Florida State to show where they are coming into the 2024 season up against, I think, a better team than a lot of people realize. Now, Georgia Tech has a very, very difficult schedule and is going to have an uphill battle to make a bowl just because of the difficulty of their schedule. But I think this is a top half of the ACC football team. Going back to last year, looking at what they bring back, they've got some things that make them dangerous. So we're going to do our usual thing and work our way through basically one side of the ball at a time, and then get to the end and do our analysis. But we're going to start with the Georgia Tech offense against the Florida State defense. So the first thing to note about this Georgia Tech team is that they have a very big and experienced offensive line. So if you look at their offensive line, they go redshirt junior, senior, junior, senior. That's a lot. And they got a lot of starts. Four of the five are guys that have been on their roster and have been in that offense. The fifth guy is Kalon Rutledge at right guard. He had 22 starts at Middle Tennessee State before transferring this year. Look, I think looking at Florida State's schedule, this might be a top 3, I think at least a top 4 offensive line on their schedule. At least in terms of running game, in terms of being able to block the run. This is a pretty good offensive line. I have some questions about them being able to hold up in the passing game in terms of against the pass rush on the edge. A little bit more question about that, but I think this is a good offensive line, and it's a real challenge to stop their running game because of it, because they've got a quality running back, a running quarterback, and a big, experienced offensive line. And that's really, in a lot of ways, on this side of the ball, that's what this game's going to come down to. They are a team that loves to spread wide, almost Bryles type wide splits. They do a lot of stacked wide receivers. They're trying to empty that box out, and what they want to do is run the football between those tackles. They have a vertical displacement running game. So what I mean by that is there's different ways to block different things. You can have two teams that block inside zone differently. One team that's expecting a little bit more horizontal displacement, so you're creating seams horizontally for your running back. That's more typical with teams that run more stretch or outside zone. Then you have teams that kind of run your standard inside zone, and they'll get at you, but they're stepping more to the side on each one. And then you got your vertical displacement type teams, and that's your Bryles type tree stuff. Even though Georgia Tech offensive coordinator is not actually it's Bryles Faulkner, who is actually at Georgia before as an offensive quality control guy under Kirby. he's not a Bryles guy, but there's some Bryles type influence in what they do, both in formation stuff and in the running game. And they want to get vertical. They want to have their interior offensive line move you off the ball. They're going to burst off the ball. They're going to try to be physical on that offensive line. And they're big. They average about 310, 315 pounds on their offensive line. It's a big group. And they're going to try to push you around at the point of attack. Now, good luck doing that against Florida State's interior, but they are going to try it. That's what they do. And they're going to run. They have a lot of variation in their running game. They'll run a lot of inside zone. They'll run split zone on that inside zone stuff. So split zone is where you have an H-back coming across the formation. Everybody on the offensive line is blocking inside zone, so trying to get vertical displacement, all stepping to one side. And split zone, you have that guy coming across, and usually he's got a kick-out block against the end man on the line of scrimmage. They actually sometimes change that up. They'll lock on the edge and have him come through the B-gap. I've actually seen them at some points leave the 3 technique unblocked and kind of trap him in what is otherwise, it's sort of like an inside zone to the right side. And then to the left side, they'll lock it with on the end with the tackle against the end man in the line of scrimmage. And then they'll kind of trap that with the H-back coming across for the split type thing. So it's really kind of almost a true option style trap. Just out of a little bit different formation. And they'll do that with the H-back coming across. Normally your traditional trap, you're going to get a guard coming across to kind of ear hole that offensive or that defensive tackle who's getting upfield. But they'll do some things like that in the running game to try to take advantage of aggression and that sort of thing. So you have to be careful against them. You can't just race upfield, or they'll start peppering some stuff at you that'll give you trouble in the running game. They'll also run a decent amount of counter, and in their counter, they're not a team that likes to log you and kind of have the back go out to the C gap and go outside a little bit. They really, when they run power or counter, they really want to go kind of A gap to B gap there. They're running A gap counter. They're running B gap counter and trying to get that inside and upfield as quickly as possible. This is a game where, Florida State tends to spill the counter, meaning you're going to have that end man on the line of scrimmage try to come across the counter, the lead blockers there, and try to force the back outside. This is a game where they're going to have to do that with some success, and ideally you want to force them outside on that. But this is where Haynes King, being as mobile a quarterback as he is, becomes a bit of a problem. And look, Haynes King is very fast. In high school, he ran a 50.7 400 meters, which is fast. That's legit fast. And he was laser timed at 4.50. So he gets out in the open field and he can really go. He averaged 9.2 yards per carry last year on just under 10 rushes per game. So, you start to focus on their backs in the running game, and Haynes King, all of a sudden, they'll do all sorts of different stuff there. They'll go jet sweep, invert quarterback power. So, almost a wildcat type play with Haynes King hitting that B gap or even the A gap, full acceleration. Some of the same sorts of things in the running game that scared you in last year's opener about Jaden Daniels. Georgia Tech will use Haynes King for a lot of the same stuff. Now, hopefully Florida State, if you're coordinating Florida State's defense, you say, oh, well, you did pretty well against Jaden Daniels last year, even though they didn't do a lot of designed run with him last year. You hope that you can do the same stuff against him, right? Against Haynes King, to be able to have the same level of success that you did against Daniels last year. They'll do power read toss. That's something you see a lot from Clemson, where it'll be quarterback power, and then you'll have a toss option on that, so that if the quarterback reads that the defense is really taking away that power option and running to the power, all of a sudden you have that toss to the outside, and the back potentially has the edge. If the defense is playing that toss well, then you've got that power coming straight downhill, and the quarterback's coming straight downhill into that B gap again. That's tough to stop. They will run all of that stuff with a a good, mobile, explosive quarterback who does create big plays with his legs. And then they add to that almost every play. If they're not lined up in twins where you've got, a stack to just try to keep you to commit whether or not you're going to have the extra guy in the box or not. And then they'll run a lot of, sort of smoke screens and that sort of thing on the outside. If you don't have the extra players out there, they'll try to make you tackle their very, very fast, and we'll get to that in a second, wide receivers in the open field on some of those screens if you don't put the players out there. And then if you do put the coverage players out there, then you've got a lighter box, and they're going to try to run straight down your throat using all this stuff with that. When they're not in those 2x2 type formations where they're, stacked receivers real wide, almost everything else has some sort of motion or eye candy to go with it. They run a lot of jet motion. They run a lot of jet sweeps. They run jet sweep and then quarterback power off of that. They'll run jet sweep, inside zone. They'll run jet sweep and hand it off. I've seen them run jet sweep and then flea flicker that. Another thing that I've seen them do is jet sweep type action or orbit motion action, play action that and turn that into an immediate screen on the backside. They really want to stretch you horizontally a bunch, and they do that with a lot of screen play, a lot of jet motion, a lot of motion before the snap, just in general, a lot of eye candy to try to put pressure on you horizontally. And then their mission, they're going to try to run between the tackles and gut you. That's what they want to do. And Jamal Haynes, 5'9", running back there, kind of a squatty type, powerful build, good player, not quite the best in the conference, but he's up there. They list him at 5'9", 180. He, to me, looks a little thicker than that, but maybe 180, and runs well. He's one of those guys that's got a powerful lower half, doesn't go down easily, and does a good job of kind of hiding behind that big offensive line. So what they're basically doing is they're putting a ton of pressure on you to try to stop the run, either stop the run with a light box or stop all those screens to fast receivers and all of that on the outside with, even numbers on the outside or less than that if you start to try to put a guy in the box. And then past that, they'll do a lot of four verts and trying to throw the football vertically. And, out of that four verts, you get their kind of sticks game, and, guys will run comebacks and things like that. And they'll run a decent amount of boot type stuff to get Haynes King out of the pocket and try to let him make plays on the move. That's really when he's most comfortable. And he will throw deep on the move and do it with some success. He's got a big arm. He's got a good deep ball in general. You watched the Louisville game last year. You could see that for sure. He's a tough fit, a tough guy to defend when he's playing his game and when he's not self-destructing with some mistakes and that sort of thing, which we'll get to in a moment. And then the other thing that they're pairing all that with in terms of trying to run downhill, use that fast quarterback as a part in that 11-man running game and all the jet sweep motion and all that. They're doing all this with a set of wide receivers that can fly. This is the fastest set of wide receivers as a team that Florida State's going to face this year. And that's probably true even if they make the playoff. So Malik Rutherford, he's mostly in the slot, 5'9", 170, and he is twitchy, tough to tackle, actually, for his size. He's one of those kind of Jamari Thrash type guys that is just a pain. Now, if you can get your hands on him, it's a little bit different, but he's a tough guy to corral, and they used him a lot of different ways. He's one of the main guys they use in that jet sweep game and some of the running game stuff. And he's a pain. Their best guy last year was a freshman. Now he's a sophomore. That's Eric Singleton, 5'11", 190. He ran 10.6 in the 100 meters in high school. I mean, we've been talking about this for Florida State. That's Jaylen Brown. You look at what he brings to the table. And Florida State went out and tried to get faster in terms of wide receivers last year. After last year, that is, for this year. And they did get faster. And who did they get? They got one guy that ran 10.4 in high school and one guy that ran 10.6 in high school. Well, Singleton ran 10.6. That guy can flat go. Now, I was going back over when I was looking at some stuff in preparation for this episode. I was going back over the Georgia Tech Georgia game from last year, and I was surprised because I hadn't really watched that last year in full with attention on Georgia Tech, I should say. I'd looked at it, for Georgia, but hadn't really paid attention to what was happening on Georgia Tech's side. And I saw Singleton, catch a ball and break a tackle, and then he was in the open field, and I watched him get run down. Now, the Georgia safety had a little bit of an angle, but he didn't give up like any steps. And I'm thinking, wow, Singleton's a 10-6 guy in the 100 meters. How fast is Georgia's safety to be able to do that? And so I looked up Malachi Starks, and Starks ran a 10.55 in the 100 meters. So that explains why Eric Singleton did not run away from him, because you're talking about a guy that's maybe even a little bit faster. But, Florida State doesn't have a safety that ran 10.55 in the 100 meters. I don't know that they have one that ran 10.8. So this is one of those things where Singleton, you've got to make sure that you do not let him get behind you in any way, because if he gets behind you, he's gone. You're not going to have anybody catch him from behind. So that's an issue. He's backed up. Well, Chase Lane is actually backed up. Chase Lane is another. He's 6 foot, 195 pounds. He's their third receiver. He ran 23.04 in the 200 meters and 49.62 in the 400 to win Texas 6A state title in the 400 meters. So that guy can go. And he's backed up by Christian Leary, who had transferred last year from Alabama, 5'10", 180. He's the guy that caught the game winner against Miami, and he ran 10.50 in the 100 meters in 2020. So you got 3 guys there that are legit track speed. Texas 6A state 400 meter champion, and two guys that ran sub 10.6 in the 100 meters, or 10.6 or better in the 100 meters. And then you got Rutherford, who's explosive. So what makes Georgia Tech difficult is they're going to spread you out and force you to single cover those guys and get one-on-ones, and then rely on those guys to create plays with their speed and make it difficult on you to keep tackling those guys in space on screens, to keep up with those guys on 4 verts and on some of the crossing type stuff that they run, and just force you to deal with their speed at receiver while trying to pound you in that running game. They were a good offense last year, y'all. This was a good offense. And, the issue with it they had was a little bit of consistency. I mean, they gave Louisville all they could handle. They beat Miami. So they gave Louisville all they could handle. Should have won that game. They beat Miami, and then they gave Georgia some problems in that game. Now, Georgia was never really threatened. It was not a game that Georgia was ever really in danger of losing, but they kept it close. And that was a good Georgia team, as we know. So, when they played, and they beat North Carolina pretty good as well. Came back actually from 21 down, scored 46 points against that North Carolina defense. This was a team that when they got going on offense, they got going. And by the way, they will also go warp speed tempo at times and cause problems with that. So they'll have a couple packages where if they get a first down, they'll make the next snap with 30 plus seconds on the play clock, and they're hoping you are not organized, and they're just trying to get the ball and screen on somebody out wide, one of their speed guys, and just cause a problem. And, they caused teams problems with this last year. And, when that team was on last year, when Georgia Tech played well last year on the offensive side of the ball, when they got rolling, they were tough to stop for everybody. I mean, they had some success against Georgia's defense. So, take that for what it's worth. This is by no means a walkover game, because I think this is a good Georgia Tech team. They returned basically all those weapons on that offense and 4 of those offensive linemen. So that said, they're also a team that was pretty inconsistent last year, partly because they turned the ball over. And that's really the knock on Haynes King. Big arm, good deep ball, super fast, can cause you all sorts of problems, especially once he gets out of the pocket. But he's had some issues if you can get pressure on him. And, looking at the Pro Football Focus numbers, when he was kept clean last year, his offensive Pro Football Focus rating, and look, you have to take all these with a grain of salt, especially individual plays and all that, caveats apply. But his Pro Football Focus rating was 86.4, which is really good. 82.7 in the passing game, 75.9 running game, 76.4 fumble. When he was under pressure, when he was pressured at all last year, he went from 86.4 overall offensive PFF grade to 44.1, which is no bueno. 44.3 in the passing game. And, that's when he had 6 touchdowns, 6 interceptions against pressure last year. When he's kept clean, he had 21 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. Now, that you can do the math. That's 16 interceptions. So, that's not great. And he also will fumble the football. So, you look at what he brings to the table. He's a good player. He's an explosive player, but he's a little bit hit and miss in terms of what he brings to the table. The thing that scares you is he's a guy that can get hot. And he gets hot with that set of wide receivers. If you get really good Haynes King, now you're in for a dogfight because that team can beat you. But if he's pressured, if you can cause him problems and not let him get outside and get into his comfort zone, then he can be pretty loose with the football. He has a pretty long motion as a thrower, and that long release, sometimes he'll get stripped in the process. He doesn't always feel pressure well, and he'll kind of move into pressure, or he'll start the throwing motion when he absolutely shouldn't be because he doesn't feel it. Actually, Marvin Jones Jr. forced a fumble on him last year in the Georgia game. And I think actually Marvin Jones Jr. is a really key player in this game because there aren't very many edge guys who, if Haynes King starts to get to the edge, are going to be able to move step for step with him. And Marvin Jones Jr. is one of them. So that gives you some comfort there that he's not just going to be able to get to the edge and then suddenly, at least on that side, get to the edge and then, get his eyes upfield and just kind of run away from your edge guys. You got some edge guys that can kind of keep with him a little bit and keep him compressed. And to me, what you want to do with Haynes King is you want to emphasize your lanes in your rush lanes. You want to emphasize not allowing him to escape. You want to make him make plays from the pocket. Absolutely critical to force him to make plays from the pocket, and you want to compress that pocket. The more he gets pressure in his face, the more trouble he's had. And he's not one of those guys that really sort of just does well either way. Now, game on the line, they'll start to run him. You get into the third, fourth quarter, they're still in this ball game, and they're going to start to run him. They're going to go inverted veer. They'll go quarterback power read. They'll do all sorts of read game stuff to get him on the move. That's what they do in the second half of games that they're in it against good teams. So you have to be aware of that. To me, if I'm Florida State, I'm coming into this and I'm banking on being able to handle their offensive line on the interior with my quality at defensive tackle. And I feel like if I can stop them in their vertical running game and still not commit that extra safety to the box, then I'm going to be able, by keeping my safety back, I'm going to give up a few plays to some of the speed, but I'm going to have a guy there that's going to keep those plays from turning into touchdowns. And with their speed, that's the thing you have to do. It's okay to give up a 30-yard play against them. You just can't let it be 70. And they're going to have a few of those plays. The other thing is, I think with the size at wide receiver, you kind of want your corners to beat them up a little bit off the line of scrimmage. Now, you have to be careful. You don't want to get greedy. You don't want to lunge and let those guys run by you, but you want to force them to have to get off of the length that you have in coverage and, force them to prove that they can beat you in that way. If you play off a bunch on them and let them have the initiative and you let them dictate where they want to go, I think you might be in for a long day. But I think you can kind of do with them what Florida State did against Jamari Thrash, who was admittedly banged up last year in the ACC title game, you can kind of take the same approach that you took with him, which is force him to get off the line of scrimmage, force him to create separation against guys that are big and strong and are able to get their hands on him and make him uncomfortable. Of those guys, I think Singleton is the one that is the most dangerous in that context to be able to get off that kind of coverage. And then Rutherford in the slot, it's going to be a real test for Florida State's slot defenders. So, those are the things that you're looking at. But I think you want to just kind of keep playing your quarters base. You want to really compress the pocket and emphasize your rush lanes and force Haynes King to beat you from the pocket while compressing that pocket and cramping him a bunch. And if you do that, I think you can hold this team to, reasonable numbers defensively. And looking at last year, their average yards per play, 4.61 against Louisville, 3.55 at Mississippi, 4.94 at Wake Forest, 3.67 at Miami, 7.09 against Boston College, 7.25 North Carolina. And actually, by the way, offensively, there's a lot of similarities with what they do in terms of creating problems for you in the quarterback run game to what Boston College did sometimes last year with Castellanos. And you have to be conscious of that. They're going to look at that tape and they're going to say, can we do the same stuff? But 7.25 yards per play against North Carolina, 6.93 at Virginia, 3.55 at Clemson, 5.57 against Syracuse, 4.66 against Georgia, and 5.36 against UCF. Now, a few things stick out. They were much better. When they played against a defense that had a clear weakness, a defense that had some issues, they went for some big numbers. 7.25 yards per play against North Carolina and Boston College, 7.09. But against teams that had the personnel to cause them problems up front and be able to cover some of that speed out wide, 3.55 against Mississippi, 3.55 at Clemson, 4.66 against Georgia. So, pretty big delta, 3.67 against Miami as well. So there's pretty big delta between how they did against sort of average to bad teams defensively and how they did against the best teams defensively. This is a team that I think Florida State could choke out if they're able to handle their business on the offensive line. I do think Georgia Tech's offensive line is going to be a little better this year than it was last year, and that's going to be a little harder. So I think they'll be better on the offensive side. They're more experienced. They return a bunch of those guys. But I think you can hold this team to somewhere around, 4.5 yards per play and feel comfortable about that. If I'm looking at this, I think somewhere around 4.5 to 5 yards per play is about what I expect. And, given a little bit of back and forth there, I think that turns into somewhere around 20 points for Georgia Tech. They've got a good field goal kicker. Wouldn't be surprised to see him kick a couple there. But I think that's about 20 points. Without, turnover help, that's about what you're getting. I think Florida State's defense against Georgia Tech's offense. Now, moving to the other side of the ball. This is where Georgia Tech had some serious problems last year. And, that's the reason they have a different defensive coordinator this year. They fired their defensive coordinator because they couldn't stop anybody last year. And especially they couldn't stop the run last year. They were 110th in the nation against the run last year. 5.59 yards per carry against Power 5 competition. That's 110th in the country. That's not good. And if they give up 5.59 yards per carry to Florida State, they're going to get blown off the field here. But they did hire well. They went and they hired a Mike Elko defensive protege. The guy that was the defensive coordinator at Duke last year is now the defensive coordinator at Georgia Tech. So if you want to look at what Florida State's likely to do against them, go back and look at how Florida State attacked Duke last year. But Georgia Tech doesn't have the defensive line talent or the secondary talent that Duke did last year. They've got some size on the defensive line. We'll get to that in a second, but they don't have really the players that Duke's defense had last year. I thought Elko did a great job of loading the cabinet there, loading the cupboard for Duke. Now, they basically are a multiple front with a hybrid player on the edge. So, they've got three bigger players on the defensive front. It's a lot like what Fuller did at Florida State when he first arrived in terms of how he approached the edge positions. And that's partly because Fuller runs basically the same kind of defense, the same defensive system overall, even the same terminology and such as Mike Elko. Very similar type of defense. So you're going to run a quarters base. You're going to be very multiple in terms of coverage. You're going to be multiple on the line of scrimmage. You're going to go three big players on the line of scrimmage, and their big players are pretty big. Nose tackle Zeke Biggers, 6'6", 320. His backup, 6'3", 305. Machias Scott is 6'4", 290 at the three technique. Or, the way this works, they're in an odd front sometimes, so it's not really a three technique, but their defensive tackle is 6'4", 290. His backup is 6'6", 315. So they got four 300-pounders that they can put in there and rotate at the defensive tackle spot. So they're big. They get Sylvain Yonjuan. I think that's how you say his name. He's 6'4", 260. They get him back at edge. He was injured in the Louisville game in the opener last year and missed the rest of the season. And then his backup, and he's 6'4", 260. His backup is 6'6", 265. So they've got some size in those three. And then their rush end is kind of a little bit more of a hybrid position, and those guys are both 6'3", 6'4", 240, 245. And they've got an or there in their depth chart there. So similar kind of to what Florida State did initially under Fuller there, and a lot like what Duke did last year. And I think more often than not, that rush guy is going to be lined up on the edge and will play more or less as a defensive end. But, being 240, 245, that's a guy that you're hoping to be able to run at. But they also are going to have, their backers a little bit tilted towards that and work towards that. So that's what they're going to do defensively. Now, I was not super impressed by their linebacker play last year. They did have a freshman, Efford. I think you say Efford. It's Efford or Efford. Who he was a freshman last year. He got better over the course of the season. You could see against Georgia, he was definitely better than he was earlier in the season when I got to watch them more closely. And so he's certainly going to be better than he was. I'm still not sold that their linebackers are really anything to write home about. And then they had major problems in the secondary last year, especially in the middle of the field. Their nickel and their safety positions were picked on repeatedly last year. You could basically dial up a slot fade whenever you wanted and run by them. And, that's not ideal. So we'll see how much better they've gotten on that. They did go to get Warren Burrell, who is a Tennessee transfer. He had started at Tennessee at one point, missed, I think, most of last year. 6 foot, 195 pounds to shore up the corner position. Amari Harvey is on the other side, and folks from Tallahassee will know who he is. He's a pretty good player. He's decent at one corner. So their outside corners aren't bad. They've got some potential there at outside corner. They're not a bad set there. It's the guys on the inside that I think you can take advantage of in the passing game. I think you can take advantage of their backers to some degree, and then their nickel and safeties. Those are the guys that I'm coming in thinking I have a good shot of causing problems for. There's a lot of space in the middle of the field when they played good teams last year. Now, question is, if you're Florida State, do you want to throw a bunch over the middle of the field? Is that what you want to ask your game one quarterback, DJU, to do? It's a viable question. But, this is a game where I think you've got opportunities for the dagger concept, where you've got a clear out route on the inside and then a dig behind it. You've got, the post climb concept that Norvell loves to run so much. I think this is also a game where, looking at what Duke did last year, I think this is a game where you're going to have to execute on a lot of short stuff. They're going to play off, I think, most of this game. And they're going to give you hitches. They're going to give you some curls. They're going to give you, your OTBs, your over the ball routes. They're going to give a lot of that to you and force you to execute on those. They're going to want Florida State to, throw a bunch of curls, and they're going to give them some seams to do that and play over the top. And quite frankly, I think a lot of the teams that Florida State plays this year are going to do that until DJU and this wide receiver core proves that they can actually make plays and that they can consistently throw and catch in those zones, I think they're going to have opportunities against softer coverage to throw and catch. That's what they're going to want you to do. But again, the real issue that they had last year was not really in the pass coverage area. They gave up a ton there, but the big problem they had, like I said, was they were 110th in the nation, giving up 5.59 yards per play against the Power 5. And they were 109th in sacks. The issue they had last year was that their defensive line was not very good. And you watch them in the various games that they played last year, and a lot of those guys looked pretty good on the hoof. They got a lot of size. I mean, they looked good getting off the bus, but those guys just didn't get off blocks. Zeke Bigger's 6'6", 320, but he just didn't get off blocks. Now, maybe, SYJ, the end that they missed after he got hurt in the first game, maybe he makes a difference as a pass rusher and in the running game. But to me, this is a game where the biggest mismatch in this game, based on returning personnel and the track record of what you've seen from these teams in the past, is Florida State's running game against Georgia Tech's run defense. And this is going to be really interesting because this is going to tell a lot about what Florida State's going to be this year, really. What I think is FSU has a really, really good offensive line. I'm talking about a top 10 in the country type offensive line with depth that's going to be able to step in and push teams around and basically play bully ball at the point of attack, not give up a ton of leakage in the running game, and be able to turn around and hand the ball off 30 times and score points and average 6-7 yards a carry. And I think that's what you're going to want to do in this game. And if you can't do that against this Georgia Tech team, that's a real warning sign for the remainder of the schedule. If Georgia Tech's getting a lot of penetration and causing problems and you're not moving the football on the ground in this game, that's at least an orange flag, if not a red flag, for the remainder of the year. I think this is one of those games where you come in, if you're Mike Norvell, you maybe give a first drive or two to DJU to kind of get him comfortable and throw on first down a little bit and loosen up that defense, uncork a deep shot or two to Malik Benson, Jaylen Brown, Ja'Kai Douglas, give them a chance to stretch those legs a little bit and maybe create a big play early. But once you settle into this game, this is a game where I think you just pound the rock and you just try to wear Georgia Tech's defensive front out with your big backs and with your offensive line. I also think this is a game where, it's a pretty good game for the tight ends to have some opportunities in this game, whether that's in the flat or whether that's on some OTB over the ball type stuff, some of the seam type stuff and, crossing type stuff down the field. I think this is a game that's a pretty good one for a guy like Kyle Morlock and some of the other guys in that tight end rotation. They're going to have some opportunities because I think what you do is you line up and you force Georgia Tech to match up against your big personnel and you pound them and you see if they can stop you between the tackles. And my guess is that ain't going to happen for 4 quarters. I also think that puts you in a position where you're probably able to dictate and play in control and not turn the football over. And to me, this game is going to be very much determined by whether you turn the ball over and whether you cash in when you get into the red zone. I mean, look, that's kind of football, all games. But what I mean by that is, Georgia Tech, I don't think beats you if you're not -2 in the turnover margin and maybe have maybe kick the ball around in the red zone a couple times. I think this is one of those games where if you just take care of the football, you don't do anything stupid, and you just run it, and you take care of business in the red zone, you crockpot this team. And I think that's going to be a lot of this season, but I think that's this game. So looking at Georgia Tech giving up 5.59 yards per carry against Power 5 competition in the running game last year, and they gave up 5.38 yards per carry total against everybody. You look at, they gave up 6.72 yards per carry against Georgia, 5.91 yards per carry against Clemson, 5.68 yards per carry against North Carolina. The one team they were able to stop on the ground was Miami. They gave up 3.51 yards per carry against Miami, including one really, really funny one. And then 8.08 yards per carry against Mississippi. So, and 6.68 yards per carry against Louisville. So, I think Florida State, you're expecting to run the football for close to 6 yards or more than 6 yards a carry in this game. Now, that's including some big plays and all of that, but that's basically what you're looking at. And out of that, you start getting your RPOs, you start getting your play action. I think this is a great game for a lot of, RPO type split stuff or split zone, boot stuff to the tight end and the flat, all sorts of things there that you can do that allow you to just play very success rate oriented football and then try to cash in with some big plays down the field as they're desperately trying to stop the run. That's what this turns into. I think Florida State runs for close to 6 yards per carry in this game and ultimately just pulls away. So that brings us to the final portion of the show where we're talking a little bit of special teams. Now, they are replacing their punt returner. We don't really know what to expect there, but they also had some significant issues with their kickoff coverage in 2023. They gave up a bunch of returns. Not a bunch of touchdown returns per se, but a bunch of returns, 40, 50, 60-yard returns. And, that's another thing to kind of look at here. I think there might be an edge there in the return game for Florida State if they are able to test that. So that's another thing to kind of keep under your hat as you're watching this. But as we look into the expectations for this game, this is a Georgia Tech team that can give Florida State trouble. And, they probably are going to have a big play or two. This is first week of the year. You usually have a couple busts, that happen somewhere in there. And, that's just first week stuff. But all in all, I don't see them as, being able to do to Florida State what they did to some of the worst defenses that they played last year, some of the lower level defenses. And, like I said, I think FSU can hold them to, 5 or fewer yards per play on the day. I think they can give them trouble running the football on the interior with the defensive line and backers that they have. And then that changes kind of, Georgia Tech wants to be able to dictate. It's kind of like the old option teams where if they start causing problems for you a little bit and then you start having to compensate, then all hell breaks loose. If you can avoid that and you can defend inside out and take away the dive, take away the inside zone, take away all that stuff on the vertical stuff, then force them to try to beat you left-handed. Now, all of a sudden you can start to choke them out. And I think that's kind of what we're going to see, maybe with a big play or two that you give up and, you'd like to clean up there. But one thing I will also note, Mike Norvell's teams so far have been dynamite in week 1. You go back to the last 2 LSU games and they played out of their head. And you could argue that those 2 games are the best 2 games they played in each of those years. In terms of cleanest football, overall being, in the best spot. Then you go back to the Notre Dame game a couple years ago, and they played way over their head in that game and should have beaten Notre Dame. So, this is where you give Mike Norvell and that staff the benefit of the doubt in an opener as well, that they're likely to play cleaner than most teams in an opener. And I think on the offensive side of the ball, that's probably going to happen again because running game travels, especially against a team that's had trouble stopping the run. So I think FSU ends up averaging somewhere around 7.5, 8 yards per play, if not a little bit more, because they're going to run the football for 6 yards per play. And ultimately, this is a game that's probably close at the half, might even be interesting on the scoreboard in the third quarter. But ultimately, FSU wears Georgia Tech down, and this is a full-on slow cooker football game. I'm going to go with Florida State winning 38-17 Once again, that's 38-17 in this game. I'm going to say it's about an 80-85% chance of winning. It's a dangerous game. You know, you're changing time zones, you're doing all that stuff, but I think Florida State is well positioned to start this year with a win against a team that I think is better than a lot of people expect and is going to cause a couple teams some real problems this year in the ACC. Don't be surprised to see this Georgia Tech team pull an upset or two against some of the better teams in the conference, because they do have the pieces to cause those problems with a dual threat quarterback and all the speed that they have on that field with a veteran offensive line. You get hot and all of a sudden things get interesting. FSU needs to prevent that. I think they more than likely will. And you move into the 2024 season with another successful opener for Mike Norvell and his bunch. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and call it there. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening and thanks for your support. I made this.